we need to talk about stress again in Chaos Zero Nightmare. And I've talked about it in the past. I've had a couple of videos talking about how the mechanic's fun and how it was a little simplistic in the closed beta test, but how it compared to Darkest Dungeon and my hopes and dreams for it. They did change it a little bit. They made it a little more complicated. I give them a solid 8 out of 10. But the mechanic is so important for your runs because you're very often, when you lose, it's most likely going to be because one of your characters had a breakdown, one or more of your characters had a breakdown, and you couldn't recover. It's very rare that you actually your HP goes to 0 without any breakdown. So this topic's super important to make sure your runs are efficient and you don't lose, you don't die, especially when grinding the order chaos mode. So there's not a ton of detailed resources out there, so we're just going to dive right in. So one of the first things you need to know about the stress meter is that the total number of stress before a character has a breakdown is 50. It's not 100, and that's important to know if you're thinking about cards that reduce stress by 5 or 2 or 10 or increase stress. You need to know it's relative to 50. So an increase of 10 from an event where you're trying to get a trade-off for some better result is actually going to increase the meter by 20%. So it's maybe a little bit larger than you would expect for each of these numbers. So just know the maximum is 50, and we know how bad it is to have a breakdown, right? You lose a third of your HP. You have to start drawing cards. You're gonna, if you have any retain cards like Orlea, you're gonna lose them. You're gonna lose, Veronica's Blistas as well. You have a chance to insta revive, but you can also, damage allies, increase stress. You can sabotage their cards. There's a lot of bad things that can happen, and we don't want to be relying on getting that insta revive on your saving throw when you're trying to get back out of a breakdown. So now that we covered that, we're going to talk about how you gain and lose stress in this game. We're going to talk about how do we mitigate the chance of breakdown in the first place, and then we'll talk about when we do break down, how do we get back into the game ASAP. So as far as I'm aware, there are 4 ways you can gain stress. The most obvious is when you take damage, especially lots of damage, your units are going to gain a ton of stress, and usually that stress is focused on 1 and maybe 2 units. It's not usually equally distributed between all of them for any particular turn, but again, taking damage. Every turn you do gain some stress usually. This is not 100% of the time, and I had confused this earlier with them changing the shield mechanic, where in the CBT, players who could shield all damage never took any stress, which made shields really strong. It's still that they don't take stress from damage because they block the damage, but sometimes your units just gain stress for funsies. So every turn you'll gain stress, and that implies that you should try to finish each fight as soon as possible. And then of course we know in the deep trauma mode, all of your units will gain stress through various ways. I wouldn't focus too much on this. There's not too much you can do. Like, are you really going to avoid non-combat areas? Are you going to make sure that your HP is higher at the end of a round than at the beginning to make sure that you don't get that little bump of stress? You don't have a ton of control over these things. And then the fourth thing is through events. And usually this is a trade-off where you're trading 5 stress or 10 stress to get some kind of benefit without having to fight or without having to do a dice roll. So those are the main ways you gain stress, but obviously we want to focus on primarily the first 2. 1, taking damage, and then of course you gain stress just for being in a fight. But far more interesting are the ways you can lose stress. So there's quite a few ways you can lose stress. There are cards. Mika and Orlea both have a specific epiphany that reduces stress. Mika's is 2 and Orlea's is 5 for all of those who say Mika is OP. Orlea has way more stress reduction than her comparatively. There's also a neutral card that can reduce stress, but it is an exhaust. It is a finale, so it ends your turn, and it is random. So sometimes if you have one unit that's super stressed and you think, oh, I have this card, it's going to reduce your other unit that only has like 2 stress and reduce it back down to 0. So this is not nearly as reliable a card as you would hope for it to be. I think it kind of meh. And then of course, some items, I believe there's one item that will make it so that every time you take stress damage, the stress will be reduced by 1, so you can take a little bit less stress. But the more important ones are first resting. And if you've been grinding order like I have, you know how important it is to rest, especially because there is an upgrade that unlocks in the order game mode where you can get 5 free refreshes on every shop whenever they have the truck. It becomes much more reliable for you to A, find the cards you want, and B, find them at discounts that you really don't need training to gain the cards that you want. And so it becomes more and more important, you'll find, to A, keep your HP up, and then B, also keep your stress low, that you should be resting most of the time while you're grinding the order game mode. And then there is a mechanic where you can reduce stress by having a large heal at the beginning of each round. The way I'd phrase it is it seems like the larger the heal, the larger the stress reduction. As an example here, I have Veronica that has a piece of gear on that heals when you crit. She crits and heals her allies for a whopping 4 because her defense is doo-doo, and you can see that doesn't reduce the stress at all. But then here, when I have a Tuffy that has a passive heal at the beginning of the round, you can see it heals with a 100% ratio, and it heals for 1 stress reduction. And then also there's an eco-skeleton I'm playing that has a 100% ratio and is also reducing stress for 1. But lastly, if I use my Will of Light, which is Orlea's mythic, that does 200 something percent, like 220% or something like that, then you can see here I'm reducing stress by 3, and you would have reduced stress for Veronica, but she's already at 0, so it shows a -0. So the main takeaway is having one big heal at the beginning of a round can allow you to reduce maximum stress. And for that reason, I recommend when you're doing a chaos run, don't get rid, if a character has a minor heal card or something like that, consider leaving that card in for a little bit, especially if they have decent defense, so that you can use that heal to reduce stress throughout the early and mid game. You can get rid of it later, but being able to play those heal cards throughout the fights may help you, reduce your stress a little bit and avoid a combat breakdown, 1 or 2 times throughout the course of your run, and give you a better chance of success. And then lastly and most interesting is the break mechanic. Break is definitely a very misunderstood mechanic from a lot of players. It is very confusing. When you reduce an enemy's tenacity / break bar down to 0, you get 4 things happen. 1, you gain 1 action point. 2, the enemy takes more damage for the rest of the fight. 3, the enemy's action count goes up by 1, so it'll take 1 more turn for them to use their ability. And then most importantly, the character that did the break will get a little bit of stress reduction. And so it's not a lot, but if you are playing if you're running a chaos where your characters have a lot of elemental advantage, you definitely want to be cognizant of this so that you can manipulate the stress mechanic to reduce stress if you want on particular characters. So if you're doing a run and there's a character whose break bar is about to break, think about which unit you want to do that attack that actually breaks the bar, because it can make a big difference in terms of having somebody go crazy or not. And while you don't have to use this as the sole reason for why you pick a particular chaos planet to run, it can be helpful to do this. It can be helpful to know what elements of enemies are shown in each of the chaos. So I have them here. The first planet has all red enemies / passion. The second one is mostly yellow, some red, so that's instinct and passion. The third one is mostly purple and some red, so purple's void and then passion. The fourth one is green and then blue, which is order, and whatever blue is justice. And then the fifth one is mostly blue, justice, and then some passion. And so as you can tell from there, most of the time, if you have a red unit like Maylin or Selena or Veronica, kind of, because of, I'll explain in a second, but those characters will oftentimes enjoy elemental advantage over enemies generally across the board. Now the bosses will all be the primary ones. So if you go into Chaos 2, you're not ever going to get a red element final boss, but you will see a lot of red element enemies. And so it'll be a little bit easier for units that have passion or red as their element to maintain their stress, because you can more often enable that break mechanic. But there are other characters that have direct tenacity damage. Calliope has some, Owen has some, Selena has some. There are a couple of neutral cards that I can show here that have some, and the occasional Epiphany. I think Haru has one as well. But it's important to note, it's just important to keep track of who has tenacity damage, and if my character is nearing a breakdown, is there a way I can use the break / tenacity bar to help them reduce their stress a little bit. And again, as always, this game is incredibly inconsistent with namings, so just know that tenacity, ravage, and break are all the same mechanic, and sometimes defeat is the same word used in the keywords for some cards, but generally these are referring to the same type of mechanic. Okay, but eventually you will have a breakdown. This game is not balanced so that you can never have breakdowns when you do runs, especially when you're running at a difficulty level appropriate for you. It's going to happen. And so what are you going to try to do when that breakdown actually happens? The first thing is that you hope and pray that you have a lot of draw. And that's because you may low roll, especially if you're fighting an enemy that will plague your cards by inserting a bunch of dummy cards like burns and shocks and whatever. You really need to have some draw. And that's why units like Cassius or Nia and neutral cards that give you draw can be super strong to help make sure that you reliably get the character that you want, and you can use their cards for free and eventually get them out of their breakout. The second thing is, if you do get neutral draw cards, I would recommend you spread out the draw if possible, as long as class restriction allows. And you can't always control this because not every draw card can go on every unit, but if in your particular characters that you're running have the option to put draw on different characters, just think about which ones already have draw innately in their kit, because characters that don't have draw, it's going to be rough for them. And this is especially true if you put a lot of cards that don't have draw in a character's deck. For example, Kayron has no innate draw in his deck. So if you put a lot of neutrals that you think are really cool in his deck and make it really, really big, just be careful that if one of the other units has a breakdown and Kayron takes up most of the deck, you're going to need a crap ton of draw to get to enough pulls to have the other character get out of their breakdown. You shouldn't generally try to make any particular character's deck too big during a chaos run unless that character has a lot of draw. For example, Veronica has 2 cards in her deck that give her draw, so she's maybe a little bit more flexible with grabbing cards that may or may not have draw in them, because if another character goes out, you can still cycle through cards a little bit through her cards in her hand. But a unit like Kayron or a unit like Lucas, who doesn't have much draw in their hand, they might be a little more dead in the water if they have a lot of cards in their hand and an ally has a breakdown. And so lastly, just a few extra tips. The first thing is fight fast to not gain too much stress. Blitz comps can work really well as long as you can kill the enemy quickly, because every turn you will be gaining a little bit of stress just for being in the fight. And again, that is meant to be a punishment so that shields are not the end all be all solution to everything. But if you can end the fight early, try to make sure that you cap and try to make sure that you get a single, one heal through a card every turn to get that extra little bit of stress reduction. And then also, another thing to think about is consider letting a teammate break down in an easier fight, grabbing some of their cards to cycle through if you can, so that you can finish their breakdown in the next fight and be stronger. You definitely don't want to be going into fights with 1 or 2 units really, really close to breakdown. That's just the recipe for disaster. So if you can, when you're fighting a previous enemy, if the enemy is doing, a shielding turn or a controller turn that they're not attacking you, and you can sacrifice a turn or 2, consider letting your ally have a breakdown and try to manage it for a turn or 2 so you can go into the next fight in a better situation. And I think that just about covers most of the mechanics. I'm sure there's more that you could talk about, but hopefully this gives you an idea of what you should be thinking about. The big thing for me is trying to make sure if you're running a particular team, try to run the order, the chaos planet that matches that unit's element so that you can have a little more consistency with getting breakdowns. Now, there are some potential disadvantages. I know Chaos 1, for example, has a boss, not even a boss, a basic enemy that tends to nuke people. So even if you're somebody like Malin, maybe you avoid Chaos Planet 1, but the other Chaos planets all have little disadvantages and advantages. Some have more AoE, some have more shields. Those things are worth considering, but in my opinion, it's more important to just make sure you have some kind of elemental advantage to help manage your stress. And with that, happy grinding, and I will catch you later.